Good morning, everyone, and can I welcome you to the 14th meeting of 2020 of the Social Security Committee. We have had one apology this morning. Mark Griffin unfortunately won't be able to make it, but can also take the opportunity before we go into the agenda items to welcome Rachel Hamilton, MSP, to the committee. Good to have you here, Rachel. Good to have you on board, and can also put on the record my thanks to Graham Simpson for his work on the committee. We now do move to agenda item 1, which is declaration of interests. So can I invite Rachel Hamilton, MSP, to declare any relevant interests. Rachel.
Thank you, convener, and thank you for that kind welcome, and I look forward to working with this committee. I have no interests to register at this point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. And we now move to agenda item 2, which is decision to take an item in private. The committee has asked to agree that item 5, consideration of the evidence that we hear today, that is taken in private. Now, given the complexities of a group discussion over video conferencing, I'm going to assume that everyone is content with that unless someone indicates otherwise. Okay, I don't see anyone indicating otherwise, so thank you for that. And we now move to agenda item 3, which is Winter Heating Assistance for Children and Young People Scotland Regulations 2020. A general update for members. You'll be aware that the Cabinet Secretary sent us a letter which was circulated to committee members just yesterday, and the letter advises that the regulations that we're looking at will be laid on Monday, alongside the response to the Scottish report, which we're going to look at here this morning. So today the committee will take evidence from members of the Scottish Commission on Social Security and its scrutiny report on the draft regulations. So can I therefore welcome Dr. Mark Simpson and Judith Patterson, who are both members of the Scottish Commission on Social Security. You are both very welcome, and thank you for coming along this morning. I'm hoping, Judith Patterson, you might want to make some brief comments before we move to some questioning. So I'll pass over to Judith Patterson now.
Yes, thank you, convener, and thank you for the invitation to discuss Scottish report on the draft Children in Scotland Regulations 2020. Our chair, Sally Witcher, can't attend today and sends her apologies. Hence you have myself and my colleague Mark, members of SCOSS. Turning to our report, if I may give a brief introduction, convener. SCOSS welcomed the proposed introduction of the winter heating assistance. It gives eligible disabled children and young people a £200 payment each year to help with their households' winter fuel costs. In our scrutiny of the draft regulations, we tried to identify where any improvements could be made, and we made 11 recommendations in total. The Scottish Government, as you've said, is planning to respond to the report and recommendations on Monday. But meanwhile, we do know that Scottish scrutiny has already influenced the Cabinet Secretary's approach in preparing the draft regulations that we have scrutinised. Committee members will recall that there were provisions in the earlier draft regulations on disability assistance for children and young people, DACIP regulations, that SCOSS previously scrutinised and reported on, including on those earlier winter heating assistance provisions. Yeah. We made a few recommendations then, and the Cabinet Secretary has included those in the new draft regulations, so we were pleased to see that. In this report, some of our recommendations are specifically concerned with the wording of the draft regulations. For example, we thought that entitlement to winter heating assistance should be extended to children in residential care, so that they're treated the same as children in hospital. We've also made recommendations that are intended to bring greater transparency and understanding around the government's policy intentions. So one example there is our suggestion that the Scottish Government clarifies its rationale for targeting winter heating assistance only in those children and young people who receive the highest rate care component of disability living allowance. And this recommendation is really aimed at joining up the social security policy with the Fuel Poverty Strategy and Fuel Poverty Act. which defines a wider group of disabled children and adults on any rate of disability benefit as being in fuel poverty. So we thought clarification would be helpful on that. And also on whether eligibility might be extended in the future, given the wider fuel poverty. Another recommendation about widening eligibility was concerning the qualifying periods for winter heating assistance, which members will have seen as tied to a single week in September. Now that follows the existing UK model, but we're suggesting that the Scottish Government looks at the feasibility of widening that qualification window to include children and young people getting disability living allowance at the appropriate rate at any point through the winter months. Our growing experience of scrutiny, and we've done 7 reports now, has also allowed us to look across different sets of regulations, which has meant that we've seen some inconsistencies in similar provisions across different types of social security assistance. And one example here that we saw was tests of residency in Scotland. So we're not saying there should be one single test, and there's good reasons why there are different tests, but we are saying it's preferable for the social security system to be as consistent and straightforward as possible. That said, there are many interactions between devolved and reserved systems that may bring additional complications. For example, the Scottish Government is dependent on DWP for the successful delivery of this winter heating assistance, because it's DWP that are providing the data required for Social Security Scotland to make the payments. Now, we're all aware of the pressures that DWP has been under as a result of COVID. And we've therefore asked the Scottish Government just to explain what would happen should that data not be available when it's expected, given that the policy intention is to deliver this winter heating assistance this winter. SCOSS hopes that the responses to our recommendations will improve the draft regulations that the committee will be scrutinising, and will inform your own detailed scrutiny of those regulations. But even where there's some disagreement, perhaps, with our comments and recommendations, we're hoping that the information that we've asked for in the course of our scrutiny will help the children and young people who will get this winter heating assistance, as well as their families, carers and advisors. And we know that the committee shares SCOSS's view that our scrutiny must always consider first and foremost those who will benefit from the assistance. So finally, convener, would be very pleased to receive any feedback the committee might have on our report, either this morning or after the meeting. We're trying to be detailed in our work, but we're also actively trying to achieve that while making our reports more concise. Thank you. Mark and I are now very happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Judith Patterson. That was really helpful, and a pretty comprehensive review of the recommendations as well. So I think my apologies in advance, because I think we can mirror some of the comments you've already made, Judith. But so a £200 payment, which is estimated to go to 16,000 young people at a cost of £3.5 million. And as you've noted, that's for young people who will have the higher rate care component of DLA. And understandably, you've raised the question about, well, how could that be extended out further, and asked the government to consider widening that eligibility criteria. So whilst I absolutely believe that would be desirable, can I maybe ask, first of all, has the Scottish Government, as a starting point, were the right to pick that indicator, those young people on the higher rate DLA, or is that the group most at risk of fuel poverty, the households most under pressure?
I think the Scottish Government has been for choosing this group is because children on that rate have care needs throughout the night, at night as well as during the day. So they're likely to need a warmer home day and night. So they've got a higher level of cost. So I think the policy rationale makes sense in terms of they've chosen a group of households that are likely to be at highest risk of poverty. And I guess our observation is that that doesn't quite square with the Fuel Poverty Act and strategy. We're well aware that strategy goes beyond cash help, however, so it's not necessarily inconsistent to choose a smaller group to pay cash help to and offer wider types of fuel poverty assistance to the wider group. But I suppose what we would like to see is how that does join up.
I think that's perfectly reasonable. That's helpful for the committee because it shows that if you were to pick a relatively, well, 16,000 children is not a small group, it's a sizable group, but a smaller group, that would be the group that would be realistic and appropriate to start with strategically, and Scotties talk about widening that out. Now, this committee's also got a budget scrutiny role, and it's not Scotties' responsibility to be part of that, but in every evidence session we look at what the consequences would be. The positive ones of giving more cash to households that could be in fuel poverty or struggling to meet their heating needs. Have you crunched any numbers around if it was to be widened out? How many more young people would benefit, how many more households would benefit, and what the cost of that would look like? Because clearly one of the things we will get as a committee will be lots of calls for additional cash to be spent, and the same pound can't be spent twice. So it's about choosing your strategic priorities and how to make the best use of the public cash that's there. So has Scotts given any consideration to some of the numbers around that?
We haven't crunched any of the numbers around that, convener. I don't know if my colleague Mark might have comments to make about to what extent the policy might contribute to reducing poverty, which is obviously one of the things that Scotts considers, given it's one of the social security principles.
Yeah, that would be great if Dr. Mark Simpson was able to come in and supplement your information. That would be really helpful. Mark?
Yeah, thanks, convener. And as Judith says, we haven't done the sums on how much more it would cost to bring particular groups into eligibility. I think our role in this is to sort of flag the options in which the policy could be developed. I mean, as members will all be aware, there's a set of principles in the Act, and one of them is about reducing poverty, but there's also one about efficient use of resources. And there will be times where there's possibly a little bit of tension between those two principles, and there will be political judgments to be made about how resources can be targeted. Certainly, as Judith stressed, the government has identified, if not the group that's most likely to be poor, certainly the group that's most likely to have additional heating related costs. So there is there's a clear logic to the decision that's being made, but it's not the only possible decision that could be made.
Okay, for the purpose of time, I'll not explore that further. It'd be a really interesting chat to work out what other groups it would be extended to and the rationale behind that. Maybe another member wants to come back to that at some point, but just for the purpose of time, I want to move on. I've got one additional question before I bring in Alison Johnson, and that's around that week in September where you have to be on that qualifying higher care component. It all seems very artificial, and it seems to be driven by the data rather than the need. So it captures the need artificially at one week in time. Winter's a long time. It's not 1 week in September. And from my reading of it, it seems to be driven by the data requirements of DWP as opposed to delivering on the policy intent. I don't know if there's. I know Judith Patterson, you mentioned this within your opening remarks. I suppose we'll be speaking to government about this as well. So if we were to push, we want to know whether we're pushing at the Scottish Government in terms of it's their policy intent to widen out the qualifying period by which you can receive this £200, or whether we have to look at the DWP, but the relationship we have is with the Scottish Government and its policy intent, and it's how they interact with DWP. So could you maybe get a little bit more information around what you understand the restrictions are, the technical restrictions, because I would hope that in policy terms the Scottish Government would be open and would see that picking 1 week in September appears a little bit artificial.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a good issue to pick on, and I do think that it's driven by operational needs. But the good side of that, actually, and a side that you wouldn't want to lose, is that operationally it allows an automated payment of winter heating assistance. So applications are not required, and that's quite a prize in social security, because obviously it means that take-up is massively increased from what we might expect to see if applications were required, particularly for a small, relatively small payment like this. The take-up could be quite low. So we think it might be possible to keep that week's qualifying period perhaps, but extend it perhaps by allowing applications in that extended period, so a bit of a mix and match approach, so not losing the benefits, but making some more gains as well, if that makes sense. I suspect that the relationship with the DWP will be critical. It's true, but I think it's the policy it controls are within Scottish Government, because they've got that flexibility to invite applications as well as make automated payments. I think also they're looking at which qualifying week it might be as part of a kind of wider look at the winter heating assistance, because obviously this is the first tranche for children, and later on it'll be brought in for people over pension age. There are issues about rural poverty and whether that's the best qualifying week, should it be retained.
That's helpful. I see Mark Simpson wants to come back in and add to that. Mark?
Yeah, thanks, convener. I think it's an important issue that you've highlighted, and I think it is one that we would encourage the Scottish Government to look at again, certainly at the point where Social Security Scotland starts to take over the administration in full of the payment. I think at the minute it's a little bit difficult to say too strongly this is something you can do, because we don't know the intricacies of the relationship with DWP. It might be that the DWP is not able or not willing to provide information on a more ongoing basis than that 1 week during the year. Maybe there's scope to negotiate when that is, as Judith says. But I think certainly when Scotland takes over the running of the disability benefits itself, then many things become possible, including changing the qualifying week, including extending eligibility to a greater period during the winter, and I think we would certainly encourage those things to be considered.
I think that's really helpful, Dr. Simpson. One thing the committee can pick up on is whether it's there's an ongoing policy intent to widen out the qualifying period, even if it's not practically deliverable, whilst the DWP is operationally in charge of it, and I'm sure we'll pick that up with the Scottish Government. Thank you. Alison Johnson.
And good morning. I'd like to ask about adequacy of the payment. The annual sum will be £200. I'd just like to understand if you know how that figure was arrived at, and are you satisfied that it's sufficient?
If I could just say to begin with, I think the figure is just taken from the UK amount for winter fuel payment. I don't know if Mark's got anything more to add to that. I'm not sure that I do, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean that seems to be the main factor informing the choice of figures. So to some extent, I guess there's an argument that it's a little bit arbitrary, but inevitably people, depending on their housing, what age their property is, how well insulated it is, where they live, and the effect of that on fuel costs. Different households are going to have very different additional heating needs because of disability, and to that extent, it's a bit of a blunt instrument, sorry, but I think it's probably best understood as a contribution towards those additional costs. If the government was to start trying to identify what each household needed in terms of heating support, it would become a hugely complex calculation, and probably quite an intrusive one as well. So there's obviously pros and cons to both, but in terms of keeping things simple, it's the only way to do it, really.
Do you think, if it is the case that it's been copied over from the winter fuel people for older people, which is £200, is it not the case that its value will have declined markedly since it was introduced? Because I think it was introduced it was introduced several years ago. Is that a concern for Scots?
I don't think it was something that we discussed in our consideration of the regulations, but I guess the issue then becomes, once the devolved payment is up and running, it becomes something that can be considered each year, and certainly if across the range of devolved assistance, if it's going to continue to do the job that it's supposed to do to the same extent over time, then upgrading something that'll have to be discussed. But I think at this point it's a case of getting it up and running, and then that'll become part of the conversation going forward.
Yeah, no, thank you. I was just about to ask if you thought uprating should be applied, and it would seem it would have to, if we are to align with the Scottish Social Security principle of contributing to the deduction of poverty. Can I ask whether you think the eligibility criteria are clear enough?
Should I take that, Mark?
Yes, Judith, when you go.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, yes. I think the regulations are fairly straightforward. I think there was one area where we thought we weren't entirely clear that the meaning was completely unambiguous, and that was about the retrospective awards of disability living allowance. And that was the policy was perfectly clearly award after an appeal, for example, but it's backdated into the qualifying week, then you will qualify. But the regulations don't say that explicitly, it's kind of implied. And that can be okay, that's a very common thing in regulations, but what you then would need to see is really clear guidance to the operational staff to make sure they get that right, and clear information for young people and their families and advisors too. So that was maybe one area that we picked out.
Convener, can I ask one more quick question?
Yes, I'm keen to get Shona Robison in as well, but yes, go for it if it's brief.
Yeah, Judith Patterson, you have commented on the discrepancy between children in residential care and hospital care with regards to this payment. Do any conversations with government suggest this may change?
I think in our conversations with government, they were very open to what we had to say about this. I don't recall that we were given any guarantees on what the response might be, but it looked to us that this might have been kind of an unintended consequence of how the regulations were framed. So I think that makes it more likely that it's easier to adapt them. And certainly one of the things looking ahead to when winter heating assistance is brought in for people over pension age, we did note that currently pensioners in care homes, not all, but some, do get the winter heating assistance. So it would have been an odd situation to see disabled children being excluded, but pensioners being included in care homes. So yes, we'll see you on Monday.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks, Alison. Shona Robison.
Thank you and good morning. Just a couple of further questions along the lines following on from Alison Johnson. Just on, firstly, whether the regulation stating that a payment condition is not met where the individual has died before the qualifying week is necessary. Do you think that's necessary?
No. When we saw that, our first thought was it's not a provision we've seen in any other set of regulations. So it kind of stood out, and it wasn't clear why it was there. It seems to us that if somebody has died, then any entitlement they've got stops, and it isn't necessary to separately legislate for that. So it wasn't necessary or even appropriate to have in the regulations. And what is more important, to have the processes sitting in the background being really sort of dignified, respectful, working for families in these circumstances.
So that may or may not be something that has been changed. I guess Monday we'll see whether or not that has been taken on board. The other question I had was around PIP, and just to ask, what needs to happen to ensure that the eligibility situation regarding 16 to 18-year-olds who may choose to claim PIP is clear enough.
Yes, we're aware that we're aware that you've got this so-called Rising 16 policy regulations coming up shortly on your agenda. Because the eligibility for 16 to 18-year-olds for this winter heating assistance is young people already on the highest rates of benefit, there's not very much incentive, I would have thought, for them to claim PIP. However, we're very aware that transition period, age 16 to 18, can be very confusing. And so what we think fundamentally is that young people need to be encouraged to get independent advice on what's best for them in their circumstances. There might be some individuals who would gain more by moving to PIP than the £200 they would lose if they stay on if they did the wrong thing. But I think independent advice is really important. But I think the issues are more likely to be with the practice rather than the regulations, because it's going to be different in Scotland from in the UK, but it's delivered by DWP. There's the risk that things just might go wrong and be hard to correct. So I think we'd like to see good guidance for operational staff and good guidance for advisors and young people as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Shona. Jeremy Balfour, you'd indicated you wanted to come in on theme 2. Mopped up most of the areas there. Do you want to follow up on some of it though?
Yep. Thank you, Camina, and thank you so far. Yeah, it was really just to go back to, I think, the Camina's first question and just follow that up a wee bit further. I appreciate, I think you answered previously, you haven't done the kind of money crunching to see how much it would cost if we brought other children into it. I suppose the one area that seemed to me missing with this was children who are on higher rate mobility, but not necessarily higher rate care. And I was just wondering, have you considered, if you could choose to extend this further, which benefit would it be, would you look at? Would you look at those who are on high rate mobility, or would it be going to those who are on maybe middle rate care? I'm just wondering, if you could have that option, which option would you go for?
I'll just say, I mean, it might be stretching a bit beyond our remit to make policy recommendations like that to Scottish Government. I will comment that the fuel poverty strategy itself doesn't pick and choose different rates of benefit. So if we were looking for consistency in strategy terms, we'd be looking at just eligibility benefit as an indicator of extra need and extra fuel poverty risk. However, as I said before, that doesn't necessarily mean that requires a cash response. I don't know if Mark's got anything to add to that more specifically.
Yeah, not a huge amount, but just to sort of flag that it's the emphasis on the higher rate care component as opposed to mobility component seems to be to reflect the fact that there are that there are nighttime care needs, that there's an assumption that the home is going to need to be kept warm 24 hours a day as opposed to 16 hours a day. So the mobility component doesn't really give an equivalent indicator of that sort of around the clock care need and therefore hidden needs. From memory, I think the fuel poverty strategy regards other rates of the care component as implying, is it 16 hours a day of hitting? So comes back to what we said in response to the initial question. You can slice this up in various ways, but the government has taken a position that has a sort of logic to it in terms of where it drew the line, but other lines could undoubtedly be drawn. But I think there is, you can see the reasoning behind the choice of the care component rather than the mobility component as the test.
Okay, thank you. I mean that's helpful. I suppose my second question, again on a similar theme that we've already discussed, is that clearly, we've had quite a lot of delay by Scottish Government, and so the DLA PIP has not yet been fully taken over by the new agency, which is really disappointing. When that happens, at whatever point that happens, can I just clarify, are you suggesting that whenever a child gets onto that high rate care, they would then be automatically entitled at the appropriate time to winter payment? So it would just be a rolling programme that you get the high rate and then someone ticks a box on the computer and you're then entitled to it over the winter period? Or are you saying there should be an ongoing period over the winter where if you get it, you're then entitled to it? I'm just trying to clarify how that would work in practice. Is it a rolling programme where the agency would just monitor when we take over this?
Mark, can I just ask you, when you answer that question, it would be very helpful, because Mr. Balfour quite rightly mentioned the delay in the implementation of the Scottish Disability Benefits, and he labelled it as disappointing. Absolutely, but it'd also be helpful from Scott's point of view to know whether it's also understandable, the delay, just to get some of that fleshed out as well. Sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Simpson.
No problem. It's obviously it is disappointing for all concerned, including ourselves. But I think in light of the situation we've had with coronavirus, many things that governments in all parts of the UK would like to have done have been delayed. There've been some very important social security developments coming down the line in Northern Ireland, which are also being delayed. So it's not just something that has affected Scotland. So I think disappointing but understandable has to be is probably an appropriate take on that. I think sorry, the question was regarding automatic entitlement. Yeah, I think that certainly seemed to be the intention, that the automatic passporting would continue, and we would assume that no matter what the qualifying period chosen was, that would be the case. And it's going to be the government's call ultimately when that qualifying period is, whether we have move the qualifying week so that it's closer to the start of winter, or whether it becomes a bit more radical. And there's always going to have to be a cut-off somewhere. If someone becomes entitled to the qualifying benefit on the 28th of February, their winter heating needs are obviously going to be less than someone who became entitled on the 31st of December. So At some point there'd be a more or less arbitrary cut-off presumably applied, but we certainly felt that it was something worth thinking about once the devolved disability benefits are up and running or are coming online.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Thank you. I've got nothing further.
Thanks very much, Mr. Balfour. We're now going to move to theme 1, but I just want to give members an indication that the Deputy Convener is going to come in on theme 3, and so far I've got 1 bid for theme 1, so if there aren't any other bids, I'll move to theme 3 after that. Please use the chat box if anyone else wants to come in on theme 1. So can we move to Rachel Hamilton?
Good morning, Mark. Good morning, Judith. One of your recommendations asks the Scottish Government to ensure the voices of young people are heard. And how important do you believe it is to include children and young people in the development of the policy and the draft regulations?
Mark, do you want to pick up this?
Yep, happy to. Yeah, well, I mean, it's important to include the voice of the service user in the development of policy and processes generally, and in this case the service user is children and young people with disabilities, and I think the Scottish Government and Parliament have obviously recognised the importance of involving the user voice in the social security principles. They've I guess set the standard quite high, and we're here to hold them to that. What do we? I mean, I think the fact is that we don't really know, to the extent that we'd probably like, just how extensively and how effectively that user group was involved in this process. We've been told that some consultation with young people and their families took place, but we don't. But there haven't been findings of that published, so we don't really know what was involved or how the policy developed as a result of that. So we're not going to say whether this is a case of weren't sufficiently involved or maybe just weren't sufficiently seen to be involved. But either way, I think it's important that both of those boxes are ticked through the process, and that those high standards that have been set are held to.
Can I come back in?
Of course.
I am also slightly concerned that there is evidence that you hadn't seen a document setting out how the process was informed, and so I was wondering if it would be helpful to ask the Scottish Government from this committee whether you would be looking to actually see that evidence and to see that documentation, as you've just pointed out, Dr. Simpson, that you hadn't been aware of that, and what the consultation process involved, and indeed who was involved and to what extent.
Well, Judith may have a view on this too. I'll give her a chance in a moment. I think there's a balance to be struck between getting all the information needed and being swamped with paperwork. And I think in some cases we've seen through the policy documents and the impact assessments that are provided that we don't get a line by line account of the conversations that occurred, but we get enough information to show that to show in broad terms what was done and the impact that it had. And I think in most cases that's probably enough to do. But I think in this case it's probably fair to say that we didn't get the clarity that we would have liked. Do you want to add to that, Judith?
No sense at all that anything was withheld from us, so we're not suggesting that at all. But I think we are very keen that we get all of the policy development information at the right time for our scrutiny, and that's not always happening yet. We really need it at the same time as the regulations, so we can see everything that led into the development of those regulations, and we're not quite getting that now. And we often do manage to tease that out through a process of Q&A over time, but obviously it's better just to have all that information up front. But I think gradually, as we scrutinise each set of regulations, things are gradually improving.
I've got one last point, if that's okay, convener.
Yes, go for it.
Yeah. Did you feel that it was easier to scrutinise the draft regulations in a standalone basis than as part of the wider regulations? And I'm very interested to see, I mean, you had extensive recommendations, which were great to see. And I'm very interested to see that you went to Twitter made a public Twitter call. And I just wondered, how much response did you have, and how valuable was the response that you received?
Yes, it was interesting scrutinising these provisions first embedded in a set of regulations and then seeing them completely separate, standalone. And not only did it make our scrutiny easier, standalone, but there was a real difference in the regulations that we saw. So they had all the necessary provisions about applications and determinations that we didn't see in the embedded version. So it looked as though the standalone regulations had also benefited from specific attention by the Scottish Government as well as extra scrutiny. So we're having observed that, was the Scottish Government also reflect on whether this is a good model to follow. In terms of our extra Twitter scrutiny, I think that we're dipping our toe in the water there. We're still developing our policies on stakeholder engagement. It's very, very important to us that we do engage with the people who are going to benefit from assistance directly, and this is one way of doing it. I think this time round it was a limited response. We didn't give people much time, but the committee did see the Twitter responses and we did take them into account. So it's a starting point rather than an end point for us.
Okay, I'm just going to make a statement here. It's not a question, but I do think that young people and children should be further informed, and that how the process is working, and indeed the future evaluation of it as well.
I'm sure that's something we can follow through as a committee to see how robust and effective that is. Let's move to our Deputy Convener next, Polly McNeill, MSP.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to ask, to what extent do the regulations fit with the principles of reducing poverty? So, I mean, I've highlighted in your report that you say that the targeting of the child winter heating allowance at children in receipt of the highest rate of care component excludes both children in receipt of DLA at lower rates of households in which only an adult is disabled, yet such households with a disabled person are disproportionately likely to be fuel poor. So you'll be familiar with that. And you go on to say that Principle H states that the Scottish social security system should be efficient, deliver value for money, and the Scottish Government's explanation is that targeting support households in which children are known to require care at night, so that warmer temperatures require for longer periods, speaks to this principle. But I noted that the sentence after that says, however, it's always important to reflect on whether efficiency and value for money are achieved at the expense of fairness. So it's that stuck out at me, and I just wondered if you did think, given you'd said that, to what extent you think that the regulations as we now have fit with the principles of reducing poverty, or are you really telling us that you really feel that we could have gone a bit further?
Mark, would you like to take this one?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, in a situation of unlimited resources, it would always be possible and welcome to go further. We're not in that position. I think it comes back to some of the previous points that that have been made, not least that there are political choices to be made, particularly when when there is a bit of tension between the various principles that are guiding policy. I think we've been over already the question of different rates of DLA. I think no matter what rate of DLA a child is on, there are additional costs to the household. But they've identified this group as having nighttime heating needs, and that's a particular cost. I think there is an interesting question around if around children living in households where an adult is in receipt of a higher rate disability benefit, because arguably the additional heating needs in that household could at least potentially be just as great. I know there's an issue around PIP perhaps not indicating care needs through the night as explicitly as DLA does, but nonetheless, someone in receipt of PIP at a higher rate is going to indicate or is likely to indicate across the board higher disability related costs in the same way that a child in receipt of higher rate DLA will. So that's certainly an issue to think about, but it might be an issue that's more appropriately thought about once the full suite of disability benefits are taken on at the devolved level. But it's probably appropriate to flag that up. I think the other issue that we've touched on before is when it comes to reducing poverty, what this payment does is it identifies again households with additional disability related costs, as opposed to specifically identifying households that are in poverty. There's going to be, there's likely to be overlap, quite significant overlap between those, but they're not the same thing. So I think it's maybe best understood as something that will make, a limited but real contribution to reducing poverty, but that, it serves other purposes as well, and they're also legitimate purposes.
Thank you.
Anything to add, Pauline? Sorry.
Only briefly, Convener, just to say to thank the committee for highlighting that particular point. It's not your decision to make, and you're quite right to point out the issue about resources, but I think it's helpful to know your view that, as Mark said, that children living in households with a disabled adult, their need may be just as great as the ones that we're helping under these regulations. And I'm grateful to the Scots that they've highlighted that. I have no further questions, Convener.
Thanks very much, Pauline. Keith Brown.
As well, my question was on delivery. Partly it's been answered already by previous questions, but it was, first of all, to say I'm grateful for the clarification that the issues with delivery are wider to and not intrinsic or unique to the Scottish Government. It's happening across the board and largely related to coronavirus. But on the issue that was raised about DWP and how the Scottish delivery will be reliant upon the DWP, the committee raised a concern about what happens if that falls over. And I just wondered whether, I know it's not strictly the remit of the committee to do this, but have you got any more intelligence on the likelihood of that happening? Are there indications there may be problems with DWP which might cause problems for the delivery of this policy?
We don't have any other indications. We've always been given to believe that DWP and Scottish Government are working well together and things are on track. But with the situation with coronavirus, we're just conscious that might potentially be at risk. it's not clear to us Aishins that might be possible at a late stage either, apart from further delay. I mean, you might think that if the data wasn't forthcoming, you could simply invite people to apply for the assistance, but I wouldn't have thought that operationally that would be possible at this stage in the day, just simply in terms of the number of staff available for Social Security Scotland and their IT systems to be able to deliver that kind of very fast-moving response.
Okay, sorry. Keith, do you want to follow up on any of that?
Just very briefly, Convener, to say that I'm assuming that given the imminence of the delivery, that it seems unlikely that there would be a problem. We'd have heard something, I'm pretty sure, from the Scottish Government or DWP on that. The worst thing that could happen, of course, is if we're told at the last minute there's an issue. But I'm taking some comfort from the fact that both SCOS and ourselves haven't heard any indication of problems with that. That seems relatively reassuring. That's all, Convener.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Brown. I don't see any further bids on the chat box at the side of the screen I'm looking at just now. I'll just give a few seconds to see if anything appears. I'm about to end this evidence session. Oh, Rachel Hamilton. There we are. Rachel.
Yeah, and apologies if I actually didn't pick this up when Alison Johnson asked the question. But can you just reiterate that there's no issues with having an eligibility in that 1 week period in September, please, for the payment?
I mean, it's a policy that's already been shown to work at UK level. It's Scotland level as well. Whether it's the best policy for the future is another matter, and I guess that's what we're asking the Scottish Government to consider. But in terms of deliverability this winter, yeah, we don't have issues about that.
Just a quick point. So if you decided that perhaps it wasn't the best policy in Scotland, can I just confirm that that would be based on factors that involved weather and perhaps the connecting it to fuel poverty targets?
I think weather and rural poverty is one issue, and connecting up with the fuel poverty strategy is one issue. That could be viewed as whether a chosen qualifying week is the right week, because essentially that was chosen, my understanding is originally at UK level, to give it further to be time to administratively get payments to people before Christmas, and that was the reason, rather than thinking, is that the best week to choose for people who are going to be getting the entitlement. And for example, might you need to get payment to people earlier than Christmas if they're having, if they have to pay for their fuel in a different way? People who've got who are not connected to the fuel grids, to the electricity and gas grids, might have different needs. We don't know. So there's one question about which is the right week, and then there's the other broader question about, well, is that unnecessarily excluding people simply for operational reasons? But bearing in mind operational reasons are very important reasons too, particularly as I said before, how desirable it is to make automated payments of winter heating assistance, and that's not something you'd want to lose sight of.
I think, Rachel, I'm not going to be able to let you back in here because of time, but I do see that Mark Simpson wants to make a comment. And I'll let you in, Mark, you are going to the last word on this evidence session, but I think Rachel's picked up where we started off the evidence session, which was trying to tease out whether Scottish Government policy in relation to being wed to the 1 week in September is dictated because they think that's the best way to run it, or because it's the only practical way to run it because of the data and constraints following discussions with the DWP. And I think that's something as a committee that we might want to ask the Scottish Government more generally. So any additional reflections you have on what you've heard, Mark, including that, would be welcome. But you will have the last word in this evidence session, Dr. Simpson.
Thanks, convener. Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly seem to be powerful reasons of expediency for doing it this way for the time being, which may or may not apply once everything's been fully devolved. I mean, I think if you're looking at it from a poverty point of view, then yes, extending the eligibility period might allow more people to benefit from it, but realistically, you're probably looking at the level of benefit and things like that if you're coming at it from that point of view. I think it's maybe more of a take up issue in terms of when the qualifying period falls, and I'm sure that's something that will be that'll be looked at going forward. If this is going to be the last word on the subject, just say thank you to members for your questions. It's been stimulating as before, and we're grateful for the opportunity to work with you on this. We look forward to the government's response next week, and to continuing to hone how we work with them as well as yourselves and over the coming months.
Thank you very much. The rest of me, of course, not to thank yourself, Mark Simpson, and Judith Patterson for attending committee this morning. So thank you in helping us in our scrutiny of these regulations, and of course for the work of SCOS. Pass on our thanks to the wider team as well. We now move to agenda item 4, colleagues, and can refer members to paper 3 and notes by the clerk. Members are asked to consider the Personal Independence Payments Transitional Provisions Amendment Scotland Regulations 2020, SSI 2020/218, and it is subject to the negative procedure. No member has made it known in advance that they have any particular issue with these regulations. That said, I would like to formally ask members, are they happy simply to note the instrument? And again, I suppose given the nature of an online platform, I'll give a few seconds, but I'll assume you are, unless anyone speaks up. Okay, thank you. We will note that. We now move to agenda item 5, which will be in private session. So we now end the public session, and I'll invite members to have a 10-minute comfort break and then come back at private session on another digital platform shortly. So thank you, everyone.